Today I'm speaking to Margot Finn, Professor of Modern British History at UCL and President of the Royal Historical Society. I was really keen to talk to Margot about the Society's recent Race, Ethnicity and Equality Report that she's championed, because I think there are key aspects of this report, especially the approach it took, that apply to the museum and cultural sectors, which, as we all know, has a significant problem in terms of workforce representation. I also asked Margot about her previous project, the East India Company at Home 1757 to 1857, because it developed a new model to how we collaboratively approach and understand British country houses and the collections they contain. Well, today we're very fortunate to have Margot Finn, who's a Professor of Modern British History at UCL, and she's also the President of the Royal Historical Society. It's quite interesting because until recently, Margot was also a trustee of the V&A. Broadly, her research focuses on British and the British colonial world during the very long 19th century, which is about 1750 to 1914. Welcome to the mini little sandbox.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you. I have a whole bunch of questions for you today, and the first one is related to the recent Royal Historical Society Race, Ethnicity and Equality Report. This came out just last year in October, and I wondered, could you tell me why you decided to initiate this report?
I think there were really two main drivers. One was that we were trying to think through how we should celebrate our 150th anniversary as an organisation. And I wanted that celebration both to have celebration, because surviving for 150 years and publishing for 150 years is a real accomplishment. But I also wanted us to look rather critically at things that we needed to do much better in order to enhance history in the next 150 years. And in that context, it really seemed that the equalities agenda was one where we really needed to play a greater role. We'd already done work on gender equality, and we published a second gender equality report a month after we published the race report. But it was really an area in which we dabbled rather than doing anything systematic. So it seemed important from that perspective in terms of being a bit critical in our reflection of ourselves, even as we celebrated the 150th. And then a second reason really was simply looking around me, my colleagues, at my students, at the ways in which who practices history and who studies history is so different from who I sit next to on the tube on the way to work or on the way home.
That's interesting. I studied ancient history at university, and I think at the time I was either the only or one of only maybe two BME students in the entire department studying as an undergraduate.
And that is changing at undergraduate level. So I am now teaching a much more diverse group of students than I was 10 years ago. But when you look at master's level, when you look at PhD level, and when you look at who's entering into permanent posts, it falls off at every level from that point. And that's really something that we can't simply allow to happen. We've got to make active interventions there.
It's interesting you say that, because I see something quite similar in the museum sector. You know, you see a lot of a whole range of people actually at internship level or temporary contract level, at quite junior levels. And the further up you go, people disappear. Could you give us some examples of the kinds of questions you included in the questionnaire you sent out to people?
Sure. One of the questions that we asked was about the extent to which people based in universities, historians based at universities, did or did not know about the Equality Act 2010. And one of the shocking results, but it was a familiar shocking result because we've had the same result with our gender report, was that a significant minority of individuals teaching in UK universities simply do not know the most basic facts about the Equality Act 2010. And very worryingly, knowledge of that act, which protects equalities, protects one's rights, is less good among BME staff than it is among staff racialised as white, and it's less good among more junior staff who are probably more at risk of bad behaviour. So that was really a very worrying concern, that one of the legal protections that we have, the most fundamental one, is so poorly known within the university sector.
I wonder if some people just assume it wouldn't apply to their work because they are already so aware and they understand what's going on. And I suppose that's one of the most dangerous things, this assumption that they have all the knowledge. They're just not quite clear how to apply it properly.
Well, I think that the global ignorance is what I can really only call about it. And I think that then has an impact upon if you don't know what the protected groups are, for example, within the Equality Act 2010, then you won't necessarily know that you're violating somebody's rights. So really that was I think a really important thing that we need to work on. And that we've seen it before in other sectors, but it really came through. And it was particularly worrying that it is particularly BME staff and BME students who weren't aware of the protections afforded by the Equality Act.
When you were putting together the questions and your overall approach to the questionnaire specifically, how did you decide which questions to include or how to phrase them? I'm asking you really basic questions simply because if somebody is thinking about doing a report for their own sector, say, and has zero experience of doing so, it's quite a useful example to start with.
Well, we did seek some professional advice. There was what used to be the Race Equality Unit and is now Advanced HE, and we got some assistance from them. So I do think paying for a bit of professional advice for something like that is actually well worth it, because you want your data to be as robust as you possibly can. Our survey is available online, so the kinds of questions that we asked and the kinds of answers that we got are in the public domain. We were worried that we might have asked too many questions, but again, we were very impressed with the seriousness with which 700 plus people, did the full report. I think that was a recognition of the fact that it's an important issue.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah.
So this must have been quite a challenging report to do. Did you find any particular aspects of it especially eye-opening, or was it broadly what you expected to see?
I was, in a way, surprised at what I was surprised with. I thought I had a better grip on my discipline, and I have to say I'm very embarrassed at some of the things I didn't know. I certainly didn't have a sense of the depth and the daily, constant drip, drip, drip nature of the microaggressions, many of which, to be frank, when BME colleagues talked about them, I began to question the whole notion of micro in microaggression. It seemed to me that the cumulative effect is so macro that that concept of microaggression was really problematic. And it took me aback that I didn't have a notion of the extent. I knew it was there, but that I just didn't have that notion. So I know many people who are racialized as white find the concept of white privilege problematic. I do not find it problematic. I find the fact that it exists and that I enjoy it, so to speak, problematic, but it really made me very aware of my own privileged position to an extent that I hadn't been before. And I feel badly that it took me so long to recognise that.
I suppose it's quite interesting. It's one of the things, I know, in the workplace you don't necessarily talk about with your colleagues. It's something you talk about with your friends at home or when you're out and about, but it seems somehow still unprofessional to discuss these issues in the workplace.
One of the things I hope that the report has really helped, partly because it's come out under the aegis of the Royal Historical Society, is it has enabled people who have been saying this or have been stopping themselves from saying it to say it openly and not to be slapped back, because we've got the data that this is there and that it's having a negative effect on our discipline. So we're hoping that that will enable some of those very difficult conversations to be surfaced and thus to be addressed.
I wondered, you've talked a little bit about, your colleagues and things. I just wondered, what has been the response from, your colleagues and the sector more widely?
I think on the whole, we've been impressed and pleased with the response. We had a meeting of the RHS Council, I think 4, might have been 5 weeks after the report was published in October 2018. And already there had been workshopping at, I think, over a half of the departments that were represented on our council. One had been a meeting at St Andrews University, not a university that I had particularly associated with BME staff or students, and over 70 persons had turned up for that meeting. And the representative from St Andrews on our council said she had never seen a meeting in the history department with so many people there. So I think that there were resonances across a very wide range of departments. So Cambridge had a meeting, UCL had a meeting, Birmingham had a meeting, Now, we all know that meetings in and of themselves are not sufficient. But the fact that we, I think, have helped to get it talked about more systematically is, I think, a good beginning sign. Because if we can't talk about it, then we're really not acknowledging that this is there, that we're a part of the problem, and that we've got to make ourselves part of the solution.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. In the aftermath of the report, how have you changed how you engage with your fellow historians or the field more generally?
I think that I've become more self-conscious of where I start. And what I mean by that in part is if I'm thinking about a lecture, I am more self-conscious about thinking, why do I start with this narrative? Why do I start with a narrative? Why is my insertion point here rather than over there? Because I think some of what we find when we look at curriculum problems is that the add, diverse, author and stir approach doesn't even do inclusivity well, and it certainly doesn't do decolonizing the curriculum. So thinking much more concretely about what the right starting points are to deliver, it could be a lecture, it could be a seminar, that is going to bring more students in, that is going to not assume that a white European standpoint is always already normative. So the beginning points, I think I've become much more self-conscious about that.
What kind of changes have you made?
I think there are probably two. One is that I'm much more comfortable now than I used to be with less coverage and more depth, because the depth can get you the complexity. The depth can point out, okay, we don't know the following things, so we can't say this, but look, we do know these other things, and that can sometimes decenter the established narrative. And then the other thing is that it does matter, as I said before, what your starting point is, and for teaching that really means what your core required readings are. So I team teach with colleagues a relatively new or completely refurbished survey on modern British history, 1850 to 1990, I think we go to. And I teach the 19th century portion of it. The first set reading, the first required reading that the students do for their first seminar discussion is about the Great Exhibition. So 1851, Crystal Palace, there's a huge literature on that. Many of them will write their first essay on that. But the reading that we give them is about formerly enslaved African-American visitors to the Great Exhibition. So it immediately gets gender history, the history of race, as integral to that moment, that great moment of the Victorian era, that we could otherwise tell in terms of class, that we could otherwise tell about the age of equipoise. We insert race right into that first discussion.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I think, when a lot of people think about the Great Exhibition, you tend to think of, quite well-to-do people gawping at unusual, exotic objects. So it's quite nice to actually, disrupt that a little bit at least, because obviously it wasn't just those people. There were so many people drawn to these exhibitions and displays.
Yeah, and it makes British history international. It makes race something that is integral to the history of the Victorian era. And of course, because it's the Great Exhibition, it's also object-based. And that's, I think, one of the places in which objects and built environments can be so useful. Because very often that narrative, that, Western liberal narrative, isn't necessarily conspicuous in that object. So it allows one to have different starting points.
Absolutely. I think often when you work with objects, it disrupts a lot of your prior assumptions, actually. And when you start digging further into, the way it's manufactured, the different materials it used, or the importance and the relevance and the colour and everything else, I think that's great, actually. I wish historians would use objects a little bit more in their work, where it's appropriate, of course. Yeah.
I think, too, the silences of the object remind one about the silences that there are in history, that very often one just pushes to one side. And then that, again, liberates additional voices.
We've all seen reports, their findings, recommendations come and go. You've all seen them in the paper or, on social media or something. And it's unfortunately often the case that very little changes. Once you've, had the initial interest and the momentum, it's all worn off and there's very little left. Do you think that the Race, Ethnicity and Equality Report is any different?
We're hoping it will be, and we're trying to take steps to make sure that it is. And I think there are two different levels to think about here. One is that the report made us in the Royal Historical Society look at ourselves and take some control of our own responsibility. So we have built into the report an annual review process in which we look at what we've done in the past year along about 10 different points with respect to the report. So the first of those audits, effectively, auto audits of our own behaviour, audits of our own structures, will be reported in November, so a year after the original report came out. And I'm hoping that we do that every year so that we see that if we're stagnating, we know we're stagnating. If we're making progress, we know we're making progress. So that's just within the society itself. More broadly, we're not like the GMC. We don't have the ability to license history departments. So we really have to be able to convince history departments and cultural organisations to take this on board.
Especially when they already have a heavy workload, diminishing resources.
Yeah, which we know is a real struggle. And there, I think it's a matter of helping to work with and inculcate goodwill, because so much of that is going to happen with goodwill. We've been very fortunate that the Past and Present Society has given us funding for a 2-year postdoc.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And the 2-year postdoc, who's been in post since the 15th of July, will be helping us to coordinate. One of the things we want to do is where we find best practice, tell everybody, look, this department or this museum tried this and it worked. Here's how they did it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Absolutely. I think that's just it. You have so many different departments, and although some of the individuals might speak to each other depending on what you're studying or researching, generally speaking, what stays in the department just stays in the department, and you don't share horror stories or success stories very well. So what will the postdoc be doing in order to try and share that knowledge or even gain any of that knowledge?
Well, we've got a working group still on race, ethnicity and equality, and that's going to continue to meet. We had a meeting in July just very recently, and we'll be meeting again in the autumn. And a part of what we're trying to do is work out how many history departments, for example, have discussed the report, how many haven't. Obviously encouraging heads of departments to get it discussed, trying to glean from those discussions whether anything is happening in consequence. One of the good developments, it's a small development, but it's a very good development, we've been trying to draw people's attention to the fact that legally it is possible under the Equality Act 2010 to offer BME student-only studentships for master's and PhD work. Now that's something that most people didn't know. I didn't know it when we began this process, and we've been telling people that. And 2 institutions have this coming year BME-only postgraduate fellowships that they've garnered money to put forward, and that's a direct response to the report.
That's really exciting. A colleague of mine at Brighton University for the Museum Studies Masters there has also managed to successfully fundraise to get funding for a 1-year master's degree, so with 0 fees to be paid for a BME person. I was fortunate to be on the sort of selection panel for that, and it's really exciting because the proposals that came in were so passionate and also academically excellent, and so it's wonderful to see that, and be interesting to see who applies again next year.
Yeah, it's a real blockage in the pipeline that is the postgraduate level, so we really need systematically to address that. The
museum sector, as I'm sure you know, also has quite a substantial problem in terms of workforce representation. So far, this situation, it hasn't been quantified or studied in any detail, and I wondered if you think there are any aspects of the RHS report, especially in terms of the approach it took, that might apply to the museum sector or even the cultural sector more widely.
I think the first thing I would say that I do think is applicable across the cultural sector is until you garner data, you don't know what the extent of the problem is. And you also don't know which parts of it you should start with. Because the problem is large, the problem is baggy, the problem is difficult to talk about. So,
and it can seem completely overwhelming as well.
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in choosing insertion points. We have to choose points where we can insert ourselves in and make a difference and know that we're making a difference. And you can't do that if you haven't scoped the landscape first. So I think a scoping exercise doesn't have to be like ours, but a scoping exercise of some sort, even if it's just talking to people, because people know an awful lot. So it could just be qualitative focus group style discussions.
Is that how the RHS report started? Is that
we did 2 sets of things. So the working group, which worked for probably 3/4 of a year before we ran our survey, did a big systematic survey. We had about 740 respondents.
That's incredible.
To the survey. Yeah, it was a good survey. And what was particularly good about it was we got lots of quantitative data, but people were very generous about writing qualitative comments. And those were extremely illuminating, really, really very, very useful for us.
I remember reading through the report actually just before we met today again, and some of them were really quite difficult to read.
Yeah.
You know, almost that they were being pigeonholed, assumptions were being made on a daily basis, and you know, not only by their colleagues but also by the students they were teaching. And I just got the impression, just reading through, that they may never have really spoken about this before. You know, they might have been thinking this, feeling this, and essentially keeping it entirely inside because it somehow felt embarrassing or unprofessional, which is really disturbing.
I think that
actually
came through very, very strongly, and certainly because we read the survey responses almost in one fell swoop, it was immensely depressing for all of us, I have to say. And I, was one of the members of the group who was reading it from a position of white privilege. I cannot imagine how horrific it would have been if I'd been one of the BME members. One of the things, in fact, that I would advise a group thinking about doing something like this, and we're certainly now thinking about this for an LGBT plus survey that we're doing. We need to have better ways of ensuring that the people who are reading the survey results are protected and supported during that process. And I hadn't thought that one through nearly well enough the last time round. So I've certainly learned that for future equalities work. It was also, however, very interesting, I think, at how many people who responded to the survey who were racialized as white academics knew there was a problem and just kept saying, I don't know what to do. There was clearly a desire to do something, but again, no knowledge of what the starting place was. And we hope the report will provide a framework for giving people both no excuse to not do anything, but also concrete things that they can do at different stages.
I think that's really important, actually, because you can have this nebulous worry about what you are seeing, not necessarily experiencing, but seeing around you, and genuinely not knowing where to start. And I can completely understand that as well. I just wondered, was there anything positive that you read in any of these responses? Was it really just quite overwhelmingly negative?
One of the things I think that came through very clearly was we did a couple of focus groups with school pupils at A-level. And one of the things we're very concerned about, obviously, is very low uptake of history at university by BME students. What came through very clearly from those focus groups was there is a passionate interest in history among BME students, whether of African or Caribbean origin, whether of Asian origin. The failure is getting from GCSE and A-level to perhaps through the first year of the university curriculum. That the types of history that we are presenting young people with are not the types of history that are going to engage them critically, and we need to find better ways of doing that. So that the extraordinary interest in history that is out there, and sometimes it's fed by museums, and sometimes it's fed by local history groups, sometimes it's fed by doing something with family history, sometimes it's fed by political interests.
Or even video games, actually.
Yeah,
you play Assassin's Creed or anything else. Actually, it's fascinating,
Absolutely, and we need to find ways of tapping into that.
Was there anything else that surprised you particularly about this overall report?
Well, I suppose because I teach history at university level, I knew that history was not representative of the broader population. I didn't know how unrepresentative it was. And it turned out when we did the statistics that we're among the bottom 5 disciplines at university in terms of racial and ethnic diversity.
I'm really surprised to hear that, actually. I didn't think it was quite that bad.
Well, that was precisely my response. And I think that one of our responses in the Royal Historical Society to that is we have to own that bad result and recognise that we play a role in that bad result, and we need to change that.
I think it's absolutely fantastic that, as president of the society, this is a report that you commissioned and really championed. So I think thank you on behalf of all historians.
Thank you.
I'd love to talk to you a little bit about your previous research project, which is called the East India Company at Home, 1757 to 1857. It's the first time I'd really come across you because you moved to UCL and I was still studying there at the time. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about what prompted you to embark on this amazing project.
So I had been working on a book, which I'm still working on actually, about the family and the East India Company. And I was discussing with a colleague who worked on the East India Company at Home project, Helen Clifford, who's a museum professional among many other things, what the material impact in Britain was of the East India Company and the Empire more broadly. And we had a series of conversations, and we were teasing out that problem of what are the legacies, the material legacies, the visual legacies, the object legacies of empire. But we were also thinking about the ways in which local and family historians increasingly are doing a variety of histories, some of which are object-based, some of which are family-based. And somehow in that sort of maelstrom of two things that weren't necessarily connected, we came up with this idea to study the impact on the English, Scottish, and Welsh country house of the East India Company, its wealth, its material cultures, its families, its politics. And to do that in part through classical academic research. We did research articles in respected journals, book chapters, and all of that. But we also invited into the project over 300 project associates.
That is quite a number.
Yeah. And it was absolutely eye-opening. And it was family historians, local historians, archivists, people working in museums, people who were just interested, and many of whom also owned objects relating to the East India Company. It might have been armorial porcelain, might have been shards of porcelain that had sunk with an East Indiaman vessel. It could be family objects as well. It could be photographs of people. It was really quite diverse what people had. And they had a passion of connecting their own history to the East India Company. And we had an absolutely wonderful time working with them and co-producing histories with them.
What do you mean in terms of co-producing histories? I mean, what sort of outlets were there for that?
Well, we had an open access website, so we published a number of case studies, some of which were family stories based on family letters that very often people had, which weren't in public archives. So they had come from someone's attic, and someone was trying to tease out 2 centuries ago what their ancestor might have been doing. And so we would help them to frame the argument, help them to find primary sources, and they would help us to come up with new objects, new resources that we didn't know about as well. And we published them on the website. We did 2 edited volumes later on, drawing on those materials and other materials that had come to us. One of my favourite objects was Sir John Sykes, who was a lineal descendant of Sir Francis Sykes, who was an 18th century East India Company merchant who bought a number of landed estates in England. And he left with his Indian banyan, or man of business, his Persian seal for doing business when he retired to Britain, so that his banyan could continue to sign contracts for him. And years later, centuries later, the great whatever grandson of the banyan brought the Persian seal and gave it to Sir John Sykes. And he then began to research this intertwined history between his family's history and the Banyan's family history as well. And it was partly this object, this Persian seal, that made that type of historical analysis possible.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So objects are really very impressive that way.
I could completely agree with you. I mean, had you worked with objects previously, or was this the first time you'd really made them almost the centre of the focus of your research?
Well, I'd done some work when I was at Warwick University with Maxine Berg and her Global East India Company project, and that certainly had object elements in it. And Helen Clifford, who worked with me on the East India Company at Home project, had been a part of that as well. But it certainly has dramatically changed the way in which I think about objects as historical sources, the way in which I think it's perfectly legitimate and sometimes preferable to start with the object rather than starting with the text. And it's definitely meant that I read museums much more critically than I did in the past.
Is that how you became a trustee at the V&A?
I think it was, I was doing the East India Company at Home project when I applied to be a trustee there, and I think it helped. It definitely helped. And I suppose also that the project, because it was co-producing historical scholarship with people, many of whom aren't scholars in the classical sense, that had alerted me to the importance of the public in historical narratives.
Completely. When I'm sort of thinking back, I remember at the very end, if I'm remembering correctly, of the project, there were a series of talks by various people, and one of them was Clifford Pereira, who's done a lot of work in this field and who I admire greatly. And there was something he said which sort of left an impact with me, and actually still informs how I approach objects and how I approach the histories around them. And he basically said, where are the brown people? I'm paraphrasing massively here, but that was the gist of his talk. And it wasn't until that moment that I'd realised this nebulous sort of thing that was going on in the back of my head. I kept thinking, something is missing. I'm not sure what it is. And he vocalised it perfectly. And I wondered, has that had any impact on your subsequent research?
Well, definitely in terms of my work with the East India Company and the family. It's very, very sort of central to what I'm thinking about. I'm writing a paper at the moment for my annual RHS lecture, which I do my emergency research in August, and we're August now, so I'm doing my emergency research.
Well, I've been to 2 of your lectures so far. They've been really good, so I'm looking forward to the next one.
Well, this one has elements of corruption, which the last one was about, and elements of loot, which the first one was about. But it started out being about Claudius Rich, who is an East India Company diplomat, who is also based at Baghdad and is one of the early collectors for the British Museum, among other repositories, of cuneiform bricks and so-called Oriental manuscripts. Now, when I began thinking about Rich, it became very obvious to me very early on, Rich couldn't have done what he did without tens and tens and tens of persons of colour working for him, with him, in the years that he's in Baghdad. He has soldiers from Bombay. His wife brings Indian servants with her. When they traipse about to Babylon to excavate, they take many, many, many people with them who enable them to do this work. And they also gain local knowledge from people living in what's now Iraq that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So to be thinking about that co-production of knowledge in the past is something I would never have thought about 10 years ago.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things, I don't know, when you see a lot of these sort of colonial officials presented to you, whether in a museum or elsewhere, they somehow are human magnets. They somehow magically stand there and objects sort of come zooming towards them from everywhere. And you think, how on earth did that happen? Was, of course, they had so many local assistants working with them. One of the ones I was looking at, quite a few years ago now, was Colin Mackenzie. And he had a whole team of assistants, and he sent them with money to go and, collect. And there's some wonderful reports which still survive. And you sort of read about, I encountered this fisher lady and she was trying to find some Roman coins. And it's a really fascinating insight because, of course, they would never have found or come across any of this material without the help of these individuals. And they're so often just relegated, rarely even to the footnotes. It's really quite sad. I wondered, given the sort of work you have done and are doing right now, how would you think it can influence the way we interpret and display colonial collections in museums or other historical settings, whether they're stately homes or anywhere else?
Well, I think one of the good things that's happened in the UK in the past 10 to 15 years is there is now so much more collaboration between academic researchers and museum-based and heritage-based researchers. And there's now funding that crosses those two groups rather than us being in our separate silos. And that's very different than in much of the rest of the world. And I think we should really think about the position of privilege we have in having those sorts of collaborations. I gave a talk once in Paris about the East India Company at Home project, and someone in the audience said, well, you were using volunteers. The unions wouldn't appreciate that. And somebody else said, and your funder allowed you to work with people in museums? It was just very clear that the expectations really were very different. So I think that's a real boon, our ability and our desire to work across those boundaries, and not to say, oh, that's curatorial and this is academic research, but to break those down. I think that in a way, I suppose the research I've been doing has also problematized the museum for me very much. The major galleries that typically will last for 20 years before they're done again, I think we simply have to find a more dynamic way of reflecting changes in knowledge. I think we also need to find a much better way of representing in the museum ambiguity absence, contradiction, what's not there, why what's there is there. I think we have to get audiences to embrace complexity. Television isn't going to do it. Radio, to an extent, can do it more. But I think the museum, we just have to somehow break out of some of those boxes. One of the things we did in the East India Company at Home project that was tried to do that was, in addition to re-representing a National Trust property, Osterley House, as not just a Robert Adam neoclassical interior, but also the home of East India Company directors, and thus chock-a-block full of East India Company bling. So part of that was drawing attention to the bling alongside the neoclassical objects. But we also got in Tamil dancing into the Long Gallery. And we also did oral histories of South Asian Britons who were living in the area, who had brought things from South Asia to their homes. We also messed with the conventional interior of the house. And I think we just have to become a bit more imaginative about doing that.
It's quite interesting. I think you're describing exactly what my career path is sort of leading to. Because obviously I've worked on one of those gallery projects, so that the Houghton Gallery, it will be there for some 20 years. But I'm also working on interventions in certain sections, and there'll be community co-curated interventions, and they'll be regularly rotated. And I managed to get funding to buy more objects as well. And that's no mean feat. It sounds like such a lovely, simple, easy thing to do, but it really isn't. And certainly with collecting history gallery talks, I think it's really important. They're completely free. They're for anyone to come and listen, and it's sort of sharing with the public the research that we are actually doing in museums. And it's interesting also what you said about the collaboration between academics and curators, because I think actually I take it completely for granted, which probably I shouldn't, because many people do CDPs, which are collaborative doctoral projects, which I believe you're doing one as well, in collaboration with a colleague here at the British Museum. I'm doing one in collaboration with a colleague in Brighton. And it's just really wonderful. We come at, a similar sort of issue or problem or idea from such different angles. And it's really exciting to see what results. And I have to say, I'm really enjoying it.
Well, when I was a graduate student, which is now obviously, a few decades ago, the idea that you could have had a PhD in history that was jointly done with a museum, people would have looked at you as if you were mad if you'd suggested that. And even, I think it wasn't really done by most historians then to write to a curator and say, I would like to see the following things in your collection. So I think the notion that those objects belong to all of us and that, we need to have access is one that's changed dramatically.
That's actually quite interesting. And I would say in the last 2 to 3 years, not more than that, I get so many more emails from students across the UK, not just London-based students, just asking, could I suggest certain objects for this essay that they're doing, or the approach to the gallery? Could I just send over some ideas for, how it worked or what didn't work? And that's never happened before to me, in my experience. And similarly, a lot more sort of student groups being brought into the museum, and I'll give them a tour of certain sections. We can talk about certain problems, types of objects, and in the study room as well. And although some of the art history groups obviously have been coming for decades, it's more unusual to have, say, history students or just archaeology students coming, and we are seeing a lot more of that, which I'm finding really exciting, actually, yet another audience to grab hold of.
I think the more we move away from purely connoissorial notions of the museum, the more it opens up to a much wider variety of types of history.
Completely. It's something I was talking about with one of my predecessors who was, in the post for, I think about 30 years, a long time, and just the approach and the way you think about an object has changed so dramatically in that time, and also what you do with your time in order to do the research. I remember sort of being told, research, that's for your evenings and weekends. And I'm thinking, what? It's a really strange approach, and I couldn't quite get my head around that. So
I think, too, what we consider to be research is so much wider now, so that, actually meeting with a member of the public who is doing family history research, can be a type of research for me. So, and I wouldn't have said that 15 years ago.
Oh,
so,
that's interesting,
I think
actually.
that we're really expanding what we understand the domain of research to be, and that expands who can be inside that domain. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I have to ask you, finally, given the overall theme of this podcast, is what does decolonising the museum mean to you?
Oh, goodness. Wow.
Thought end on a nice one.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that one of the questions is whether museums can be decolonised, whether they are so fundamentally themselves artefacts of colonialism that you'd have to disband them to decolonise them. I suppose, as an historian, what I want us to do first is to understand the colonialism of the museum. And I don't really think, whatever decolonising it is, that we can do that until we have a better grip on the colonial foundations of the museum.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed our discussion. This was really great. That was me, Sushma Jansari, talking to Margot Finn, Professor of Modern British History at UCL and President of the Royal Historical Society. For me, one of the key messages that came out of my conversation with Margot is how important it is to work collaboratively and with a medium to long-term strategy to challenge the norm and to start to reshape the sectors we all work in so that it is a positive place for everyone. This episode was produced by Nick Harris and me, Sushma Jansari.